Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The Iowa caucuses are around the corner, and there are still a number of contenders in the Democratic field. The challenge is this: to win the presidency, you must win the party nomination. But to win the general election, you have to appeal to some conservatives, don't you? You have to take a few of those Trump supporters, or at least that would be what logic tells us. So the question is, are the positions of Democrats aligned with the positions of most Americans? Unfortunately, the answer seems to be no in a number of cases, and yes in a number of others. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But of course, we want to talk to you about why you should care, and hopefully it's clear, because these issues and the people talking about them and the result of this election will determine the next president of the United States. And it's probably safe to say that the most powerful person in the free world has some sort of impact, or at least the possibility to create impact on your life. So there's a lot of ways you could care, but that's a pretty straightforward one. Of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on elections, Democrats, and all things political without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
No, this is an interesting article when you talk about how both sides, we talk about having for Republicans to tack to the right in the primary, or when they say, well, this Republican is facing a rough primary race because somebody to the right of them is now running,
right?
In the primary. So, it's an interesting, the article or the essay is about the Democratic Party, but I think it applies to Republicans, as you say, as well. When we get these extremes, how you have to maneuver the primary system in order to get to the general election.
Right. Well, and part of what the article points out that I think a lot of people don't think about on a regular basis is the fact, part of what you said, but also this idea that, typically once you get to the general election, you can count on a large percentage of Americans voting with their party. But the primaries are actually where a lot of that discretionary decision-making comes into play, because typically voters are less informed about their candidate options, and they're having to choose amongst their own party. So they're having to learn more about the candidates and what each of them stands for, rather than just saying, I'm voting for the Democrat, because if there's 6 or 8 Democrats, right, that I can vote for, it's not as simple as saying, I'm just going to vote for the Democrat. I guess unless you just play eeny, meeny, miny, mo and see where you end up, right? But if you're not going to do that, then you have to take some time to actually make a discernible decision on who you're going to support and why. So what we're going to look at, and the way this is going to go today, is we're going to talk about some of the places where the quote unquote Democratic Party or certain candidates are. We're going to go over some of the stats about where America is in the first segment. And then in the second segment, we're going to look at the 4 front runners in Iowa and New Hampshire and see how do they match up with this? What do the numbers about what in the general election the country will support? What do they tell us about the candidate options and who the most viable choice or choices are? So that's first and second segment. And in the third segment, Lance and I will talk a little bit about what is the Democratic Party today, right? What do they stand for, or what should they stand for, and what's their path forward? So we've got a lot to get into, and we'll get started right now. We're referencing an article from the Wall Street Journal. As always, if you go to thestateofus.org, you can follow along with the article. It is an opinion piece, and it's entitled The Democratic Victory Playbook. So if you go to the website and scroll down, you'll be able to see the title of this episode, and you'll be able to find the article that goes with it. So they start right off by explaining that a Medicare for All plan that replaces, and this is the key here, that replaces private insurance is supported by 64% of Democrats, but only 41% of the electorate. So this is the idea, right, that we get rid of private health insurance,
right,
and we go to just Medicare for all. And only 41% of Americans, Lance, support that. And really, 64% sounds like a lot, but only 64% of Democrats support that.
Right. Only 2 out of 3 Democrats support that. So at least at the time when the poll was taken.
Correct. And this is, for what it's worth, these numbers are based on around July of 2019. So they're not super old.
They're not up to date, but they're not old either.
Right. They probably haven't shifted by 10 points or more.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting because you look at some of these candidates choose to differentiate themselves on issues that even Democrats themselves don't have super strong support for, right? I mean, 2 out of 3 is pretty decent, but it's still not, it's nothing like 80% or more. So the next thing that we'll look at here, and this one's kind of interesting, 60% of Democrats back opening a national health insurance program to illegal immigrants, compared with only 33% of voters overall. So there's one where you're getting even further away from the mainstream.
Right. And then that's what happens. And the reason we're talking about this is because in a primary, you have to get the Democrats to vote for you so you have a chance to run in the general election. And with all of this media out there now and these devices where we can keep tabs on everything that you say, if you say something in Iowa or New Hampshire to get you that momentum in the Democratic Party so that you say something very left of center that you maybe don't necessarily believe in, but you say it so that you can get the donors, so that you can go to South Carolina, so that you can go to Super Tuesday, have the money to go to Super Tuesday. Then when you run in the general election, bam, Donald Trump pulls this out and said, well, wait a minute.
Right.
Back in February or back in March, you said you were for this. Now what's going on? Yeah. And so that's the risk that you're running, is that you have to play to the ultra Democrats in the party in order to get or do you? I guess that's the question. Do you have to play to the far left to get the nomination and then backpedal to try to win in the general election in November? And that's,
I don't know if you do though, because
and they talk about that, and I didn't know when you wanted to bring that in. There are some people that say you don't need to do that anymore because Democrats are going to vote for Democrats, Republicans are going to vote for Republicans because we're all so partisan. But then the article also points out that 1 in 5 people are swing voters, where they haven't made up their mind. 20%, which is what, here we go, your favorite number in the whole world, Justin, 40%.
Right.
40% are going to vote for the Democrat. 40% are going to vote for the Republican. No matter what they say or what they do, we have 20% in the middle, and you're fighting for 11%
of those,
of that middle 20% so that you can win the election.
Yep.
In the key states, in the key areas to win in the Electoral College, which is not what today's show is about, but just in general terms, you're fighting for that middle 20% to come your way. Because no matter what you say or do, you're going to get 40%.
89% of Americans favor extending mandatory background checks to weapons purchased at gun shows and private sales. 89%. And we haven't done that. And that begs a whole different question, right? But 89%. Nearly 3/4 of Democrats and 2/3 of all Americans support legalizing marijuana nationwide. Okay.
Right. Well, there are some other issues here as well. Government regulation of drug prices backed by 80% of Democrats and 2/3 of all voters. And people want to add a public option. They may not want it themselves, but they want a public option out there. 91% of Democrats and a 70% supermajority of the electorate. So you don't have to necessarily, like you point out here, there are issues. There are grounds within this issue. There's an area within each of these issues where you can take a stance and support and get Democratic support as well as general election support.
Right.
So that's a nice point that you're making with some of this information, is that yes, you can go so far left that you're going to hurt yourself in the general election, but there is room there to take a changing stance on some of these social issues that has support by a majority of the electorate. So, you can talk about change in healthcare. You can talk about the legalization of marijuana. You can talk about, drug prices and not alienate that entire 40% of the other side. And so that's where I think if you're looking to run for president against Donald Trump, that's where you need to be. find those areas where you can still fit within your Democratic Party ideals, but have support from the majority of the voting electorate.
Well, because it seems like to me, Lance, the thing that people have forgotten, right, is that we just had an election, the last presidential election, right, where the person with more votes didn't win. So it's not, and that's the other side of this, right? It's not just about what will most Americans support. It's what will Americans support in the areas that matter most. And when you look at the areas that matter most, they are generally slightly more red than blue, Well,
you're looking at what? Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia,
Florida,
Florida.
Yeah.
But those, but that center grouping right there. Most people are saying, Ohio's off the map, that it's already Trump country and, fight not as much. Right. So it's more Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Florida.
Well, but think back to
is where, the presidency is going to be decided because everything else is pretty much has over that
seems pretty firm
10 to 11% area that's pretty safe. Now, in presidential politics, it's a long time till November. I mean, you can look back historically and there are a lot of things that happened in January, February, March, April that changed the outlook of the November race. But right now it seems like those are the 5 areas. So do you, now we're playing campaign manager. Do you find a stance that will get you to be able to turn those states so that you can win the election if you're a Democrat? Or do you go with another nationwide campaign and hope you build up enough momentum and tsunami to wipe out those thin margins that President Trump had back in 2016?
Well, there's the difference too between the short-term and long-term strategies, right? And that's actually part of what we're going to get into next, because we're going to look at the 4 frontrunners, right? The 4 people that at the moment are the most viable in the Democratic field. Doesn't mean that a couple of the others couldn't make a run on it, because we've seen stranger things happen. So
that is true.
It isn't to count them out, but we got limited time, so we're going to look at the 4 frontrunners in Iowa and New Hampshire and talk a little bit about where they stand and what Lance and I think their odds are. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
89% of Americans favor extending mandatory background checks to weapons purchased at gun shows and private sales. It's rare that you get 9 out of 10 Americans to agree on anything, but especially guns. And I think that's one of those signs, that's one of those indicators that you have to think about, what are current presidential candidates talking about? Is this one of the things they're talking about? And if they're not, why not? Why aren't they talking about the middle ground areas? Well, that's because, at least as William Galston points out, who's the author of the article in the Wall Street Journal that we're referencing today, he says, quote, "Some Democratic strategists reject my concerns as obsolete. Swing voters have disappeared, they claim, replaced by polarized partisans. The party that best mobilizes its base will win, and that means running on issues that excite the base." So that's what some strategists are thinking, Lance, and yet we know that about 1 in 5 Americans, 20% of the country, are swing voters, right? Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that are going to make the decision about who the next president is. I mean, ultimately. Now, their counter would be, if we get enough people, right, who are Republicans or Democrats to go vote, then we can win. The question is, are those people that aren't voting, are they really Republicans or Democrats, or are they the swing voters and you just finally had a candidate that motivated them to go vote? So, and that's the mystery, right? I mean, that's the argument, that's what we don't know. But let's look at the 4 front runners in Iowa and New Hampshire right now and talk a little bit about where they fall on this spectrum. Who do you want to talk about first, Lance?
Oh, let's talk about your favorite and mine, Bernie Sanders.
Okay. Yeah. That's sarcasm, by the way. If our listeners if they haven't been listening long, and they don't know Lance and I very well, Bernie is not our favorite, not because of him personally, but because of his position. So Bernie, right?
Yep.
You want to start, or you want me to
go right ahead?
Start.
I picked, you go first.
Well, if we take it one by one, healthcare, we got a problem here, right? Yep. Because Bernie's idea is to do away with the private market, because his claim, and again, listeners, this is where you step in. You know that Lance and I aren't big fans. So if you don't think we're doing the position justice, you have the opportunity to go to thestateofus.org, get involved on our social media, and let us know that you have a different opinion, and that's okay. But my take is that what Bernie's argument is, right, that we need to do away with private health insurance and go for Medicare for all, is because that will ultimately yield the best system. Right. Doing something in between, like a Medicare for all option, right? In other words, we don't do away with private insurance, but if you want the public option, it's available.
Right.
His argument is that is only a Band-Aid, and it really it won't actually make the situation that much better. Now, on the counter to that, there's other candidates that feel differently. But do you think that that's a fair analysis of his
that's
position?
Fair. And then,
so
there's there's and we tend to agree with them, that what he says he can pay for all of this.
Right.
And, the quote, air quotes, free college option and his new healthcare plan. And he can pay for all of this. And you and I don't see how. And we are staunchly, over the last 6 years, have argued that we need to be talking about deficit reduction, not doing programs that are going to add to the deficit. A topic of which is not being discussed
at all
among any candidate for either party.
Right.
So we think it's one of the most important ones to talk about, and nobody's talking about it. But that's my biggest problem with Mr. Sanders, is that I don't believe that his policies can be paid for and are going to add to while I maybe don't disagree. I mean, I kind of do, but sure. I kind of see his point with some of his ideas that, well, okay, there's a logical argument there. I do not believe there's any way that it can be paid for. And with the deficit being a major issue for me, there's no way that I can then. That's why he's not one of our favorites.
Well, it's a lot of, and I think part of the problem, right, with him and of the four, if we can agree that, and I think that most people would, that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are further in the left camp. For sure.
At least the way they're running. Bernie is for sure.
Yes.
Elizabeth Warren.
That's how she's running.
Has been tacking herself that direction since before the 2016 election. So you would have to say the last 6 to 8 years she's been going that way. So Mayor Pete and
Biden
and Joe.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think
those I'm assuming we didn't talk. I'm assuming those are your top four.
Yeah. Well, going. Let's be fair to explain to people, how are we getting the top four? We're getting the four that have consistently polled at the top in the last couple of months in Iowa and New Hampshire.
Correct.
That's what we're doing. Now, granted, it's important to understand that with their margin of error, they're all sitting right around 20%. So,
which is why we're choosing four.
Exactly. Because
there's not a real front runner right now.
Yeah. It doesn't, you can pull any poll out, and there's been ones that have had Buttigieg or Biden or Warren or Sanders in the lead, but they're all each time within that margin of error where, if you add 4 to the bottom and you take 4 away from the top, now your front runner is a totally different person. So it's kind of, I guess it's immaterial, right? Whether or not they're coming in quote unquote first in the poll or not, because they're all within that plus or 4 typically plus or minus 4 percentage points margin of error. So, I think, with both of those, Lance, they're definitely, I think Biden hasn't talked as much about insurance from the Medicare perspective. He's talked a lot about improving Obamacare, which makes sense.
Well, and even with his gaffes and mistakes that he's made and the attacks because he was in the lead by so much for a long time, the attacks that the Democrats have made on him, his poll numbers are still the best against Donald Trump.
Right.
Be it whether we agree with him, like him, or what, and I agree that he hasn't tacked as far left, but in that mock election of a Democrat versus Trump, Biden is still outperforming the other three. So he's still seen as more. So, I mean, I don't know, does that prove that people want a centrist candidate? Because, I mean, I would have to say that Biden has made some mistakes and misspoke and made some gaffes and shown maybe a little bit of lack of mental accuracy as he's gotten older. He's not the same candidate that I had hoped he would be, but yet he's still polling better than anybody else in the top 4 when it comes to running against President Trump in November.
I was trying to find, I'm on his website, and I guess it's not a great sign that I can't quickly find his plan for health insurance. Oh, here we go. Plan to protect and build on the Affordable Care Act. That's what he calls it.
Well, I was going to say he was when we did our housing renovation article on the healthcare plan.
Right.
That was where Mr. Biden was. He was on,
yes.
We're going to keep the existing house and we're going to build some super cool looking chimneys and porches on our existing healthcare system.
Yeah. I mean,
for those of you who have been listening in the last 6 to 9 months, we did a home remodeling show based on healthcare and where the leading Democrats were.
I guess I'd say his biggest problem, Lance, in regards to healthcare is that he doesn't have as simple and sexy of an option as the other 3 that we're talking about.
Right.
Because in Bernie's case, right, and Warren's case, it's real simple. It's Medicare for everybody and we get rid of private insurance.
We're going to tear the home down and build a new house.
Exactly. And then in the case of Buttigieg, right, we've got the Medicare for all who want it, which is, essentially what they talked about here, which is this idea of adding a public Medicare option or something like it, in addition to private insurance, which is supported by 70%, a supermajority of Americans. So at least in both of their cases, while Bernie and Warren's plan is only favored by 41% of the nation and Buttigieg's is by 70% of the nation. But in both those cases, it's real easy to tell people what it is.
Exactly. Right.
And in Joe's case, he's got this long page and his bold headline is as follows. So we've got Medicare for all who want it and Medicare for all, right? And now we have build on the Affordable Care Act by giving Americans more choice, reducing healthcare costs, making our healthcare system less complex to navigate.
Well, it's like the policy walk of Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Come up with all these, 500-page reports that nobody can understand or get through.
Nobody knows what it is. And it's kind of vague because you say you want to build on Obamacare and it's like, well, what does that look like? So, I mean, and to Joe's credit, it's probably definitely a more centrist take, but at the same time, he might be better off, if he went with the Medicare for all who want it, just because we know that 70% of Americans know what that is and they want it.
But is he playing for the swing voters? Does he think he has, again, does he believe, are his numbers that he's gathering show him that he has enough of the Democratic support to win the nomination and he's playing that long game?
Right.
Not the short-term game. He's playing the long game and then I'm going to get the nomination and I'm going to be sitting pretty to run against President Trump. I don't know. I think that's probably what his plan is, what his strategy is. So we shall see.
Yeah. And so that's when you're looking at the 4 of these. Healthcare is a big one because it's one of the areas that's easy to see the differences in candidates. But there's a couple other areas that they differ as well. We're going to talk about those coming up and also look a little bit at what Lance and I think. What should the Democratic Party do? Forget the candidates. What should the party do moving forward? Because these last 2 election cycles, if anything, have proved that the party is indeed divided over what it stands for. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
There are 4 frontrunners in the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire, according to a myriad of polls. And Lance and I are looking at where these candidates stand in relation to where America stands, right? Because ultimately, the question isn't so much about who's going to win the primary. Sure, that's important, but who can win the general election? And the reality is the candidates that are put forward, or the candidate by the Democratic Party, is going to play a major role into whether or not Donald Trump will be the next president. How likely is it that that person can secure the much needed 20% of swing voters, or at least a majority of that 20%, at least 11%, right? In order to win the presidency? That's the big question. And the one I want to entertain something here for you for a second, Lance, and get your thoughts, because I mentioned this briefly before the show, where I was caught in a little bit of a conundrum, because I've told you before that I think that a lot of times the mindset, okay, and what I mean by that is the type of person that a voter's willing to support. That's what I mean. In terms of their personality, okay? Forget about what they stand for. I'm talking for a minute about how they behave, how they interact with voters, what they do. I think you see a lot of the polling backs it up, a lot of parallels between the mindset of people who support candidates like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, these more popular type candidates who are advocating and saying, right, lots of things that people like to hear. And that's part of why I think Trump took some place like Ohio, which Obama took before him, twice. So that shows you that kind of dynamic flow of if a candidate has a message that resonates, what happens. And you and I have talked a lot about, well, maybe, what you have to do in order to win, right? Our general line of thinking is you have to win that middle 20%. But what if you steal 11 or 12% from a crowd like the Bernie Sanders group, right? If I'm Trump and I want to win and I want to ride off the center of the road candidates, or I'm Bernie and I want to win and I know there's no hope of me convincing the swing voters, can't I just steal 11% of Trump voters? Can I just do that? If I figure out the message that I need to speak to them in the same way, the right way, why not steal from the other extreme instead of steal from the center, where I know I can't get, because people like Justin and Lance are going to see what I have to do as unreasonable. But these other people on the extremes, they're more open to unreasonable things because they support it all the time.
I know what you're saying, but I don't think there's any way you can, a Bernie supporter would ever vote for Trump, or a Trump supporter would ever vote for Bernie. I still think they're stealing from the center or from the mid-center over. They're not stealing from the far right or the far left. You're not going to get a Jim Jordan type to ever vote for Bernie Sanders, or anything like that. So I don't think.
But a Trumper and a Jim Jordaner aren't necessarily the same person. I'm talking about the people who don't typically go vote.
See, well, I'm trying to answer your question. What I think is that I think people are voting now, at least if we look at the last 5 or 6 years, for personalities and not for belief systems. We tried this. It's like, I tried the new Coke. I don't like it. Let's go back to the old Coke. I thought the new Coke would be good. I was ready for a change in my life, and I really wasn't that excited about it. So I voted for Trump, because we know that more people voted for Trump than admitted they voted for Trump, because the number of people that have admitted they voted for Trump, he never would have won the election. So they tried it. They didn't like it. And now we're going to go back to a more normal, are we wanting to go back to a more normal political atmosphere? Or do we want this way out there right or left personality to shake things up? And I think that's where your argument is with Bernie and Donald, is that it's not necessarily stealing the voters. It's the voters liking that personality and saying, oh, we've tried this. Now let's try this. Well, that didn't work. So now let's try this, because we have this, we've talked about it in a lot of issues where people don't have a very long attention span anymore, and they want to see change and they want to see different. And so, well, I tried this for 4 years. Well, okay, let's try this for 4 years. And then let's go back. I think that's more of the argument. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I would take it that direction, in that it's more of a personality ideal.
I think there's definitely, there's definitely a personality component to it, right? Because if there wasn't, if it was still truly about the issues. Even more so now. There's always been a personality issue, but I think even more so, at least that's what 2016 showed me, because they didn't care about all of the horrible, I shouldn't say horrible. The president would say horrible, very horrible, horrible, but they didn't care about Trump's private life. They didn't care about whether or not he had paid taxes, or what he said about women, or whether or not he paid people, or his college was corrupt, his university was. Nobody cared about that. It was like, hey, this guy says he's going to make a difference. He's going to change things. Let's see what he can do.
It was kind of, I mean, that was kind of the attitude is,
Yeah.
let's see what he can do.
Right.
Okay. So now we've given him 4 years. We're going to give him another 4 years, or have we seen enough? And now it's say, oh, let's give Bernie a chance. I mean, he's way out there and kind of a crackpot, but no more than Donald Trump. So let's give Bernie a chance for 4 years and see what he says. And that's where I think the argument is, not whether you're stealing from the other side or not, but will that out there personality play to enough people?
So
and maybe it will, but I don't know where. The only thing I want to say, and then I'll give it back to you, is that I really do think a guy like Bloomberg is going to come in and take the Democratic nominee. I really think, that's where my support lies right now.
Interesting. Well, that's probably a separate episode, but
it is.
I want to hear more about that.
I just want to say that because we talked about the top four, and I really think he's going to be the voice that somebody of the top four is going to have to deal with. There's going to be a shakeout of some sort before Super Tuesday in March.
Interesting.
And whoever that person is going to have to face Bloomberg.
So here's and I did not pull this up before I asked Lance this question, so it wasn't a setup. I was Googling while Lance was talking there to see if I could find any support for the idea that Bernie supporters actually helped Trump win in 2016. And
do they say they're helping him win because they didn't vote?
No.
Oh, okay.
This is the interesting
that's where I can see they would have helped.
Sure, right.
Because I'm not going to vote for Clinton, and by God, I'm mad because it was stolen from Bernie, and Bernie should have been the nominee. So I'm going to stay home. And because they didn't vote, Trump was able to win in the Electoral College. I could have seen that argument.
According to NPR, and we will provide this link on the website. So if you guys want to read the full thing, because it's pretty interesting and there's charts. So, can't go wrong there. Fully 12% of people who voted for Senator Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic presidential primaries voted for President Trump in the general election. And that's according to data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which was a massive election survey in 2017 of around 50,000 people. For a perspective, a run-of-the-mill survey measuring Trump's job approval right now has a sample of about 1,500 people. So it was a massive sample, which indicates higher accuracy of the poll.
Right, but I would still claim the reason they did that was an anti-Hillary vote, not a pro-Trump vote. Trump didn't go out and get them because of his belief system. They voted for Trump because they were mad that their person didn't get the nomination, so it was a way to stick it to Hillary.
Well, and they dug into—
That's my argument.
Right.
I'm not saying it's right, but that would be my argument.
Well, and they did, and I'm glad they did. They dug into a little bit of why they did what they did.
All right.
And they say that party seems to have had something to do with it. Sanders-Trump voters were much less likely than Sanders-Clinton or Sanders third-party voters to have been Democrats. So the people that voted for Trump were actually Democrats, more likely to be a Democrat than people who voted for Sanders and then for Clinton, or voted for Sanders and then for a third party. Likewise, approval of President Barack Obama appears to be related as well. Sanders-Trump voters approved of Obama much less than other Sanders primary voters. So if they voted for Sanders in the primary and voted for Trump, then they were people who were likely to not have liked the job that Obama had done.
Interesting.
Which, if you think about, makes sense because a lot of Hillary's platform was a continuation of Obama. And then there's the race. Nearly half of Sanders-Trump voters disagree with the idea that white people have advantages. So, it's kind of almost a different episode all on its own, but, and it ends with caveats. To answer the question that many Clinton supporters may be asking, by this data, yes, there are enough of those Sanders-Trump voters who could have potentially swung the election toward Clinton and away from Trump. Specifically, if the Sanders-Trump voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania had voted for Clinton or even stayed home. So here's a contrary to popular belief.
Right.
If instead of going to vote for Trump, if they had just stayed home, those states would have gone to Clinton and she would have won 46 more electoral votes, putting her at 278, enough to win, in other words.
There you go, because you need the 270.
It's fascinating. You guys have to check it out. We don't have time to dig deeper into it, but very interesting
Just goes
stuff
to show
here.
it's wide open. Nobody really knows.
Right.
And it's going to be interesting after the last election how closely people follow the polls.
Oh, yeah.
Because the pollsters and the pundits were so wrong. Is everybody just going to totally disregard it and those folks are out of a job? Or, how strongly will they get out in front of the numbers and say, this is what's going to happen? Or are they all going to take a back seat and say, we don't really know?
Right. Get a little more cautious as a result of some of what we've seen.
That's what I think will be fun is
yes,
for those of us who follow these kinds of things and enjoy them, to see how the pundits talk about the numbers.
Yep.
Are they so gung-ho and we're going to stand behind them? Or are they going to take a back seat and say, yeah, well, after 2016, we don't really know what these numbers mean.
I think, Lance, the key for the Democratic Party is to acknowledge that being less left is important.
Of course.
And I think that's for the Republicans too. I know it's working right now with Trump, but at the end of the day, like if we're being really honest, if you look at where Trump's positions are historically and even currently on a lot of issues, he's not really typically in the Jim Jordan camp.
If you don't talk about what he says and you look about what he does.
Right. What actually happens.
He's much more centrist in his actions than he is in his voice.
Well, and think about what that accomplishes, right? Centrist voters are typically not as loud, right? And they're also typically more thorough, hence why they're centrist voters, because they go through and look through the record. What did you actually do? What did you do for me? Or what are you saying you're going to do, right? Where the bases,
the sound bites,
they like a lot. Yes, they like what you're saying, right? What are you getting rah-rah about? So you think about it, and I mean, it's either he's really lucky or he's really got this figured out, right? It's one of those two.
Yeah.
And the question is,
exactly right.
Can the Democrats find somebody who can take that on and convince those people who voted for Trump, right?
Yep.
And hold on to their primary voters. I mean, they lost 12% of them to Trump.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
So that's an amazing number.
And I mean, they tell them right there, right? That would have been the difference. I mean, that would have brought her 46 more electoral votes, gotten her 278, and she would have won.
It's crazy.
Got to hold on. That's the base can definitely be important. That's for sure. And so can swing voters. So the question is, what will determine this election? There will definitely be more coverage to come. Let us know your thoughts. thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. We've got articles, books that Lance and I are reading and upcoming, and we've got a lot of guests the next few months. So we're excited to share all of that with you. And if you want to invite other people to tune in, because this is a syndicated radio program and a podcast, Lance, right?
That is correct.
So if you want to invite others, and we encourage you to do so, because it's critical to accomplishing our mission, Lance, right?
It is.
What is that mission, by the way? Well,
our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And you can tell them how to get a hold of us and listen to us either by, they can go to Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.